You're probably familiar with this scene. It's the morning after, and in two human brains, unconscious circuits are buzzing around and looking for answers. Like no other sphere of life, love puts us at the mercy of our automatic brain. Your gut feeling says, wow, but you have no idea why. And you sure don't know exactly who the person is you just woke up with.
The decisions we make are not driven by any conscious thoughts. The really important decisions, for example, should I be with so-and-so woman? And you write down the reasons why you should be with her. And you write down the reasons why you should not be with her, and they're very long. And of course, you choose to be with her. And who's in charge here? I claim it's the unconscious mind. Consciousness is almost like an afterthought. I mean, some argue we don't even have it. It's just kind of a PR exercise in the brain of letting you think you're involved.
Ireland's west coast, an ordinary workday for Mickey Smith, surf photographer. No computer on Earth will ever master his job, because Mickey's workplace is constantly changing. Low tide and high tide modify his world in an endless loop, and every wave breaks slightly different than the one before. What keeps Mickey's head above water is a marvelous trick of our mind that scientists are just beginning to understand: human intuition. Like the surfers he's filming, Mickey just doesn't think when he's walled by tons of water and crushing waves. Mickey's brain just triggers incredibly fast routines, unconsciously calculating what will happen next and how his muscles need to react. Without him knowing, Mickey's mind has compressed each and every wave of his life into a gigantic database. He has a feeling for every wave by now.
A surfer anticipates how the next wave is going to be and how he needs to adapt. In conscious mode, he would never be able to cope with such a complex, highly unpredictable environment. That would totally overwhelm us.
Matthias Brand, professor at the University of Duisburg-Essen, studies the secret messages of our unconscious mind that guide our decisions. In the Iowa gambling task, subjects select cards from 4 stacks. Meanwhile, perspiration is monitored on their skin, measuring even minimal stress reactions, much like a lie detector. There are good stacks that regularly provide small gains of money, and bad stacks that lead to losses. Slowly but surely, the subjects develop a preference for the good stacks, but only after more than 80 rounds can they explain why. Yet their brain knows better long before. After just 10 cards, Brand is already measuring stress reactions, preceding each choice from a bad stack.
Before our conscious mind kicks in, even before we have a vague idea what is good for us, we can already detect bodily signals that caution us against adverse decisions. Those bodily signals don't originate from true bodily discomfort. They must be traced back to the excitement of our brain. That's the way our brain can lead us in our decision-making.
Dann wiederum wahrnehmen können und die uns sozusagen unsere Entscheidungen etwas lenken kann.
Es beleidigt uns.
We feel insulted that we are marionettes in the hands of our unconscious, which then decides when it's finally time for us to do something else or think different thoughts. Even new conscious thoughts are fed to us by our subconscious.
None of us know why we do what we do, whether our brains are replaying childhood memories or fabric softener commercials, even though we should have left for the office quite a while ago. Going against our unconscious mind, conscious reason often draws the short straw. Thinking consciously puts a strain on our brain. That's why it's limited to a few computation centers within our cerebral cortex, the millimeter-thin layer covering our brain like a wrinkled bathing cap. Our conscious intelligence is mainly confined to the front side of the cap, and it's easily overwhelmed with just one thought or 5 units of information at the same time. Our conscious reason is roughly located above our eyes, within the orbital frontal cortex, but it never makes up our mind on its own. As below, our cortex, a different type of reasoning is operating, relying on our past experiences, archived by the hippocampus. Consciously, we might just recall fragments of childhood pillow fights, a bliss of love, or a choking fit, but unconscious memories determine what we do. The key circuits, the amygdala, our fear and panic centers, and their opponents, the pleasure and reward centers, both define conscious control. These secret agents of our minds scrutinize the world outside before we become aware of it, and their reports are efficiently condensed as feelings. The cerebral cortex receives these messages, yet cannot trace them back. Our consciousness seems to be hardwired to deny unconscious influences. Instead, it just makes up nothing but good reasons why we've got a soft spot for pillow fights.
It's not like with consciousness, the old brain was thrown away. Consciousness was added on and sort of had to learn how to work with the existing unconscious brain. And of course, that's how natural selection works. It's incremental. It's small steps. It's not huge, dramatic, all of a sudden you have a new brain put in. So the old stuff is still there, even though it may seem anachronistic or outdated or something. It's still there, and it's still very much influencing us.
What is the minimum speed at which your brain can make quality choices? By which we mean basically you're not choosing at random. And we have put the bound in around 213 milliseconds. So this is very, very fast. In many cases, by the time you're really thinking about this, you have made up your mind about whether it's good or bad.
Air Force pilots of the Richthofen fighter squadron are training above the North Sea off the German coast. When the F-4 Phantoms are flying at twice the speed of sound, jet pilots are pressed into their seats with up to 9 times the force of gravity. Up here you need particularly fine-tuned antennas for any short messages from your unconscious mind.
The hardest decision is always, what exactly is the aircraft still able to perform at this very moment? How much leeway do I still have? In aerial combat, I need to judge in no time. Can I still try to bring down the enemy aircraft? Or is it smart to back down from this combat? As a jet fighter, you're supposed to make such decisions in a split second. Can I venture into this, or do I stay away? That's always the crunch point.
the flight simulator at Whitman Air Base. Even experienced pilots are regularly trained here. What we call intuition doesn't come out of thin air. It's based on experience and on endless repetitions. The more often a pilot and his weapons officer go through complex procedures, the less excited their brains become. Experts require just a fraction of the energy wasted by beginners' brains, because they no longer have to ponder over everything they do. In critical situations, pilots maintain crucial reserves to attend little details that might turn into a matter of life and death. Perhaps some of you have noticed all the little changes, but imagine you're not sitting on a couch watching TV. You're in an American jet fighter. Iraq War, March 28, 2003. Orange markers are supposed to identify friend or foe, but you'll mistake these markers for enemy rocket launchers because you've been told again and again there are no friendlies in the combat zone. Your codename? Popov 36. Popov 35 is flying next to you, and in a few seconds, you'll kill a British soldier.
Okay, well, we have orange rockets on them. I don't think until these days put rocket launchers would be great. Get him! Get him! Good hits. Pop off 3-4, aboard your mission. You've got, looks like we may have a blue on blue situation. God bless it! Confirm those are friendlies on that side of the canal. I'm gonna be sick. Yeah, this sucks. Orange hell, dude. God damn it. Must be dead.
There are many processes in the brain that act incredibly fast and out of this kind of illusion of control because they're too fast, that include a lot of very high quality computations. It's really the way that you would like to solve things if you had the time to think. So just because it's fast doesn't mean it's irrational or careless or things like that.
In the endless stream of data splashing over us, our brain excels on each level and fails on each level. Unconscious errors, however, are hard to spot because these errors are influencing us without us being aware of it. Our brain is programmed to create meaningful connections even if there aren't any. That's why you can understand this film. Your mind concludes from the shower scene that our main characters have gotten out of bed. But in real life, you have no idea what your brain cons you into. Did you choose 843? Then your brain pinned a 3-digit number on you. That's because you had in mind the 3 digits of your phone number. Experts call this effect priming, and we constantly fall victim to it. We fall in love with people after sharing a thrilling or dangerous experience. We spend more money at an auction after randomly contemplating high numbers. And even under the shower, we're not safe from being primed.
We found that the lonelier a person was, the more often they take showers or baths, the warmer they like the water to be, and the longer they stay under the water. Now, what that says to us is that lonely people are substituting the missing social warmth in their life that's making them lonely with physical warmth. And I'm sure it's not just from bathing. It could be my version is fires and fireplace. There may be other things, maybe a hot drink.
In Yale, John Barge has tracked down the scary power of the unconscious. He proved, for instance, that we easily warm up to new acquaintances if we meet them over a hot drink, but tend to be more reserved holding a cold drink. John Barge is the undisputed expert on priming worldwide, and yet he is not immune to the effect. In a complex world, it usually makes sense that our surroundings and our immediate past influence what we're doing. But Barge came up with some astounding results. After a language test with words like wrinkles, grey, or hearing aid, even young students at Yale walked more slowly to the elevator.
People sat in hard chairs or soft chairs and then negotiated. And people sitting in hard chairs took a harder line and didn't compromise as much in their negotiations. People in soft chairs took a softer line, were more compromising. People who held a heavier clipboard then thought the person they were evaluating was more serious about their work and was a more serious job candidate.
Surf photographer Mickey Smith owes his fondness of nature to his unconscious mind too. But why we get a surge of endorphins watching dolphins, nobody knows. Nor why surfers get a rush from the magic ride in the tube. In the towering swell of the Irish coast, it all falls into place. The light of conscious thought is just a narrow tunnel amidst the infinite surges of our mind. And our reason has little input on what we are or do.
Intuition generally refers to our gut feelings. It generally refers, it's intuitions, that we feel something is right or feel something is wrong. And these subjective feeling states are hugely important. They're the signals that our brain is giving us as to whether something is safe to do or the right way to do something or the wrong way.
The brain constantly tries to automate because it's more effective and faster and more precise, less accident-prone in automatic mode. And this is also the case with even the most noble emotions. Even the most precious emotions are automated.
Whether we fall in love or play ball, we always learn from experience. If we had to consciously coordinate every movement, we would quickly conk out. Because thinking hard makes our brain burn as much energy as our muscles. The posterior parietal lobe is feverishly calculating trajectories of the ball and all fellow players. And our rational mind in the forebrain is consciously planning each and every move, setting off a long chain of command via the primary motor areas, cerebellum, brainstem, and spinal cord, all to the muscle fibers involved. conscious control is tiring and accident-prone as it slows us down. When our brain jumps in without us, peak performances turn into child's play. So far, no computer can catch balls. If we do something by heart, our conscious commanders are dimmed away, and striatum and basal ganglia take over. We throw and catch balls easily, and we're not thinking about it. Or do you know exactly what your fingers do when you're catching a ball? Or what each muscle in your body does when you're dodging a punch? Well, you better not start thinking about it, because your brain may contradict itself. While the striatum is firing its automatic commands to the motor centers, your forebrain might come up with different ideas. Your motor centers are confused, you're getting slow, or making mistakes. Running on automatic brain usually means running smoothly, but also running on beaten tracks. Adapting to sudden changes is the last thing on our mind. January 15, 2009. US Airways Flight 1549 ends with an unscheduled touchdown on the Hudson River. After losing both engines, Chesley Sullenberger, a former fighter pilot, decides to go straight for the emergency landing. Neglecting any time-wasting protocols, his intuition saved the lives of 150 people on board. On July 16, 1969, the whole world was spellbound watching one of mankind's greatest adventures, the start of the first manned mission to the moon, Apollo 11. But it might have failed without the intuition of Commander Neil Armstrong. The board computer was about to land the lunar module in a steep crater, but Armstrong, also a former fighter pilot, decided to switch to manual control. Without Armstrong's intuition, the lunar module, Eagle, probably wouldn't have been able to get back to the command module in orbit.
40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up the step. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight step. Listen, tranquility base here. The Eagle has landed.
The fine line between intuition and failure can be incredibly thin.
Creativity is an act of rebellion, by definition. You have to be downright subversive to break the rules and to confront conventional wisdom, don't you? I mean, it's by definition not. And if everyone accepts what you're doing when you do it, you're obviously not on the forefront. I mean, you're doing something that's within the paradigm. I mean, to me, if everyone accepts what I'm doing, I'm in the wrong field. I might as well go to the beach.
Sydney in Australia, adopted home of American neurobiologist Alan Snyder. If you know the city, these pictures are triggering off a chain of associations in your head. You don't just see the aerial images, you see what you know. And even if you've never been to Sydney, maybe you're thinking of Crocodile Dundee, the Olympic Games, or the Opera House. Alan Snyder is an expert on all kinds of expectations in our heads. He calls them mindsets, unconscious thinking routines. And Alan Snyder is working on turning them off. In his lab, Snyder has subjects puzzle over matchstick equations.
ready to go for the next one?
Yeah.
Once his colleague Richard Chi has set up a false equation, the subjects may only move one matchstick to get it right. Each subject must solve 27 equations, and except for the last one, each solution follows the same principle. So, why don't you join in?
Okay, let's do another. 2 equals 10 minus 13.
At the beginning, it takes India a bit longer to figure out a solution, but her brain is already looking for a pattern. Soon she'll realise that she always has to change a Roman numeral 10 into a 5, or vice versa. Having learned the trick, India will fail in the last round. To solve this puzzle, she needs a different solution, but India is already blind to new ideas.
This one's a bit trickier.
Well, keep trying. You have what long? 6 minutes to get it.
Still only one matchstick.
Yep, still only one matchstick on either side of the equation.
Snyder believes that being an expert may also keep us from being creative. But he's discovered a way to undo the process.
Isn't that fascinating that we're going to enhance creativity, not by exciting part of the brain, but by turning part of the brain off?
India's head is being measured and then treated to 5 minutes of electrical impulses. The impulses are supposed to turn off a particular area in the left temporal lobe while stimulating the right lobe at the same time. If everything works out, India will be able to solve the equation afterwards. After just 5 minutes, all subjects were considerably more creative.
The idea of an artificial mechanism, be it pharmaceutical or electromagnetic or whatever, yes, I think that is something that we will have in 20 years. Yes, I think that is very conceivable. The ability to look at the world afresh. Marvelous tool, not just for scientific advances, not just for doing poetry, but also for relieving and prejudices of all sorts of kind that you can imagine, right? Seeing someone the way they really are.
Unconscious filtering systems guide us through the turmoil of everyday life like an internal navigation system. Only in one specific case, our mind does just about everything to keep us from seeing others as they really are. When we fall in love. Scientifically speaking, falling in love is a stress reaction. Our panic buttons, the amygdala, become active, which otherwise spring into action when danger's afoot. Being put on alert sets off the excitement that we feel when we fall in love. At the same time, the panic mode turns us sort of blind, making sure we don't look all that closely at our partner. At the same time, our reward centers jump into action. Endorphins, opiates produced by our brain's hypothalamus, make us euphoric. So do the mood-enhancing serotonin. This cocktail of bliss acts like a drug on the nucleus accumbens, the switch in our brains that anticipates rewards. We experience the other's absence just as a withdrawal. As for our brain, love is an addiction. So we generously overlook that the love of our life doesn't even offer us a bread roll. While our cerebral cortex, and thus our consciousness, is swimming in happy hormones, the hypothalamus triggers the production of cortisol, a stress hormone, narrowing our field of vision when we're at risk or in love. At the start of a relationship, we're easily to be taken advantage of. Neurobiologically speaking, we're addicted, blind, and stressed out. And we're becoming more and more alike thanks to the male sexual hormone, testosterone. Surprisingly, the hypothalamus and pituitary gland throttle its production in men in love, while women in love produce more of it. And thus the drug of love keeps having an effect for weeks, or even months. We can hardly keep our hands off each other. This is the phase when we would most likely produce offspring, had human brains not invented contraceptives. After 6 to 9 months, the ecstasy finally begins to fade. But if everything goes well, we're already on oxytocin by then, a pair bonding hormone that our pituitary gland produces during orgasm. Women also produce it when breastfeeding. Oxytocin doesn't create stress, but bonding, tuning us for long-term commitment, as our unconscious mind wants us to take good care of our offspring, even though consciously we would deny any such thought.
You can walk into a room and find somebody extremely sexually attractive. And so you go to bed with them. And sure enough, while you're having sex with somebody, you're driving up dopamine in the brain. And then after orgasm, there's a real spike of norepinephrine, very closely related to dopamine. And those two chemicals in the brain can push you over the threshold into falling madly in love with the person who you were just casually sleeping with. So you found them sexually attractive, and then the brain triggered these feelings of romantic love for the person.
Helen Fisher studies brains in love using computer tomography. The anthropology professor lives in New York, but even in this modern metropolis, people are steered by prehistoric, completely unconscious circuitry. Dancers Rob and Sarah have been a couple for more than a year, and researchers can give them hope. Even after 20 years of relationship routine, Helen Fisher finds the same activity in the reward centres of the brains of happy couples. But why do we fall in love with certain people and not with others? In search of an answer, Helen Fisher questioned 28,000 people. She's certain there are 4 archetypes of brains determined by hormone levels in our heads. Explorers driven by dopamine and serotonin-driven nest builders fall in love with partners of the same type. Testosterone-driven directors, in contrast, fall for negotiators who are driven by estrogen. But none of this is conscious to us.
You are carrying in your brain all kinds of unconscious mechanisms that are going to naturally draw you towards some people rather than others. Just by what they're wearing is going to signal their background, their educational level. Just the way they move their body is going to signal how much energy they've got. Just the way they move their face is going to, and even the shape of the face is going to indicate the amount of testosterone they've got, the amount of estrogen they've got. And the brain is so unconsciously calculating all of these things.
Our brain makes decisions long before we do. In Berlin, John Dylan Haynes has proved that our brain is several seconds ahead of us. He studies human decision-making with magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. Active neurons use more oxygen, and so the MRI machine lets scientists see which areas turn on when. Haynes asks our protagonist to complete a simple task.
I would ask you to just press spontaneously either the left or the right button at any time you freely choose, all right?
In the lab, our decisions and ultimately our free will are reduced to the push of a button in order to identify the brain patterns of activity. Normally, millions of nerve cells light up for even simple thoughts. But one single push of a button is an easy enough task to generate commensurable brain activity. And the results of all the tests are amazing.
He found that the activity of the brain indicates what choice the test person is about to take, as long as 7 to 10 seconds prior to the conscious decision. So it appears the brain induces and programs the decision. And at that moment, when we finally have the feeling, now I'm deciding, most of the decision is long taken.
In our everyday lives, we don't notice what our brains decide without us. Our consciousness cannot trace back the source of unconscious influences. It can merely counter the arguments by thinking. Which clothes we wear, which partner we choose, unconscious circuitry has always decided before we start thinking about it. Did you just yawn? Yawning is contagious, an unconscious reflex. The more susceptible you are, the deeper your empathy with others. You read emotions into all gestures and faces.
We found activity in a little factory called the nucleus accumbens, and this particular brain region is linked with intense addiction. And I had always maintained that romantic love was an addiction, a perfectly wonderful addiction when it's going well, and a perfectly horrible addiction when it's going poorly.
Ich habe keine Lust mehr drüber zu reden, ganz einfach.
Jetzt hast du keine Lust mehr. Erst sprichst du es an und dann wird's wieder unter den Tisch gefegt. Machst du auch ständig.
Ich habe jetzt keinen Bock mehr drauf.
Ach, keinen Bock mehr.
Ja,
drauf.
geh.
Ja, dann schweigst doch wieder unter den Teppich. Was ist denn dein eigentliches Problem?
Muss es jeder mitkriegen? Muss es jeder hier?
Even when we argue with the person we love, unconscious circuitry is at work, allowing conflicts to escalate against our better knowing, or just by chance. Sometimes even the best reasoning isn't as important as the chairs we happen to be sitting on. On the other hand, all that's sometimes needed to settle a conflict is a sip of hot tea. Or laughter. We aren't laughing because we find others amusing. We laugh because we feel closer to each other. Our brains laughed long before we could speak. And even today, we react extremely well to a great laugh.
You're trying to come up with a story to tell your daughter at night, and you're thinking about it cognitively, but the ideas just pop into your head. You're having a conscious experience and you have some feeling of control for what you're thinking, but if you're honest, most of the things are just pumping there, so into your conscious awareness. So I just feel that the interesting question is not to what extent is conscious versus unconscious, but to what extent are the computations able to generate adaptive choices, good choices.
Antonio Rangel's laboratory in Pasadena studies why we buy what we buy, and why our minds experience pleasure when we eat or drink. Sometimes he gives his test subjects a special treat while they're lying in an MRI machine. Through a plastic tube, Rangel pumps samples of red wine right into their mouths. With every sample of Cabernet Sauvignon, the amateur wine testers are told the price of the bottle. However, Rangel is selling them the same wine twice. One time as a $90 wine and the other as a $10 wine. With a $90 price tag, the Cabernet activates the pleasure region in the cerebral cortex. But with a $10 tag on the same wine, our brain has much less fun. Our consciousness takes note of the price and that alone influences the taste, regardless of the wine's quality.
What should a company do with this? Well, one lesson is that they have to be careful when they choose prices, because not only they may affect the decision at the time of purchase, but if they also affect the experience afterwards, they will affect repeat purchases and the taste that people develop with respect to their products. So remember, what the study shows us is that this is not an illusion, it's very real. For the brain, thinking that it's a better wine leads to more pleasure.
So, you think you're a conscious shopper? Well, you better think twice. Why, for example, are the fruits and vegetables usually placed at the entrance to a supermarket? Because healthy stuff in the shopping cart appeases the naysayers in our mind. So we put more of everything in our carts later on. No matter what we put in the basket, our brain has already discussed it amongst itself before consciousness kicks in. The nucleus accumbens, both the factory and unconscious memory of all good feelings, indicates by increased activity that it's keen on those extremely sweet waffles. It knows that we love sugar and floods our brains with dopamine. And we really stock up. The counterpart, and thus the killjoy on all shopping tours, is the insular cortex. It's activated by rotten smells, bad jokes, or anything disgusting, like the price being too high. If this part of the cortex gets in an uproar, we won't buy anything, no matter what. The more excited our nucleus accumbens gets, the more we fill up our shopping cart. If the insular cortex is ahead by a nose, we get stingy. We're not deciding rationally in either case. We're simply following our inner voices. If we can't afford something we want to buy, the amygdala puts in a word as well. For this unconscious panic button, a potential loss is twice as worse as a potential gain, saving us from risky investments. In the end, big spenders are no less unreasonable than stingy ones. They're just obeying different unconscious circuits. Occasionally it helps to switch on our conscious mind, our intellect. It may point out health risks or empty accounts, but it can only curb our limbic centers. It can't switch them off completely. But being on autopilot also has its good sides. Otherwise, we'd stand in front of the shelves for hours, unable to make up our minds. On autopilot, we're really fast, especially with all products we know from memory.
One of the best examples of looking at the world through your mindsets is looking at our memories. Our memories are not literal. They're reconstructed to fit a story.
But Snyder wants to turn off our memories. Join the game.
Tom, we're going to show you a number of objects on the screen, 12 of them, and then we're going to ask you if you've seen them before. So Richard's going to start the test now.
Yes.
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 No.
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 All subjects quickly find the pattern, yet they become blind to details, just like Tom. To switch off the unconscious filters that prevent him from seeing the world as it is, Helen Snyder and Richard Chi will paralyse Tom's left temporal lobe with electrical impulses.
We don't have conscious access to how our brain formulates ideas. Basically, what we see is the information efforts combined into holistic ideas and concepts and labels.
Clearly, sometimes our intuitions and our impulses are wrong. For example, there's cultural stereotypes about people in societies being not as smart or being lazy and whatever. And as children, we're soaking in those cultural influences from TV, from our classmates, from our parents, and others, and they're sort of in there also as these implicit effects. So we have biases that shouldn't be there.
The implicit association test reveals hidden prejudices we all have but would consciously deny. Subjects have to sort photos or terms into certain categories. But it gets interesting when two categories are combined that might be contradictory, according to common prejudices. For example, white people or bad versus black people or good. The majority of people tested, no matter if they were black or white, are slower at this task or make more mistakes, because we're all working against unconscious prejudices, even if we consciously think we don't have any.
There are things going on that we don't intend, that we don't know why they're happening, and yet they're guiding our behavior.
It's not very evolutionary advantageous to be able to think about everything slowly and look for novel solutions. I mean, we want to be fast at the familiar.
So it's Mayday. It's an emergency. So it's Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Down to 300. 300 or Mayday.
Decisions in a complex world always carry risks. The invention of flight simulators, as seen here in Amsterdam, reduced crashes caused by human error by more than 70%. In 1 million decisions, pilots today make less than 4 errors.
Checklist, no memory items. Right generator fail was confirmed. If right main bus fail is also displayed, it's not, then effective generator on.
That's because a simulator trains our brain to do what it can do best, processing thousands of data sets simultaneously and breaking down the results to an emotion. Our consciousness kicks in a split second later, and it can review the messages from below like a pilot checking the instruments in a cockpit. But like any aircraft instrument, even our automatic brain can be subject to failure.
Maybe the best thing to do is make your decision, that's fine, but then make it somewhere else. Think about it somewhere completely different, or the next day, or somewhere else where it's a totally different set of these random influences. Now, if you make the same decision time 1, time 2, then you can be more confident about it. But you might not feel the same in this other situation because other kinds of things are operating. So if you reliably make this, when the context changes and all these primes and influences that we're talking about are a different set, and you still make the same decision, that's something maybe you can trust.
So we don't know if Martha and Jake will live happily ever after. We just invented the two of them to entertain you. But the invented story has already left an imprint in your mind, just because your brain has decided to keep on watching. By now, new networks have wired up inside your head, as our brain changes with every new experience. And if your brain found this film somehow memorable, you'll surely remember Martha and Jake.